From the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., Call on Congress. The program discussing national issues that affect Oklahoma. Your host, U.S. Representative Tom Cole.
Thank you for joining me today for another edition of Cole on Congress. Today we're privileged to have with us as a special guest from the proud state of Louisiana, Congressman Charles Boustany. Serving his second term in the House of Representatives, Congressman Boustany serves as a strong voice for conservatives. Charles currently sits on the House Agriculture Committee, the Education and Labor Committee, and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Congressman Boustany was born and raised in Louisiana and originally chose to pursue a career as a surgeon. Later, he ran for Congress in 2004, and just 1 year before Louisiana endured a devastating blow by Mother Nature through the hurricanes of Rita and Katrina. Charles has been an important advocate for his constituents in the wake of these disasters. His work on their behalf has provided him with great depth of knowledge and understanding of disaster situations. He's here today to discuss his experiences and his work with FEMA. So, Congressman, great to have you here.
Tom, great to be with you.
Well, I've got to begin. You got to tell me how a surgeon decided to run for Congress. So, number one, how did you become a surgeon? And number two, why did you make a decision to leave a very successful career?
Very successful career as a heart surgeon, and 12 lengthy years after college of training, medical school, and so forth to become a surgeon. And I had some arthritis problems, and I was at the peak of my career, but I was always interested in public service. And when I read the newspaper one morning, and it just struck home that Louisiana had the worst roads in the country. Our children were leaving the state to find opportunities. We had poor education, a whole host of problems in the state. And I figured it's leadership. It's political leadership that's needed, and that's why I decided to run.
Well, I remember your race because you weren't supposed to win.
I know.
That was quite an upset. Well, tell me just a little bit about your campaign, and we'll get on to FEMA and
Sure.
the disasters.
Well, I was unknown politically, and the first thing we did was we decided to get some name recognition was to raise money. So I just got out a blank piece of paper and wrote a list of names down of all my close friends that I thought could give me some money, and we started working on that, and we were able to build up a pretty good war chest. And then when the first quarter report came out, everybody started calling, and then we launched the campaign. But interestingly, in August before the race, I was only at 4%. And I remember someone in the press asked me about that, and I said, I didn't realize I had that many relatives or I'd operated on that many people in the district.
Well, you must have had some of your friends when you were calling them say, are you crazy? Why are you doing this?
My best friend, the first 10 guys I called said, what's wrong with you? Are you crazy? But, I was able to convince them that we need leadership. We need someone who was dedicated and was going to put the time in to really trying to address the problems that our state's facing. And my God, I got a chance to do that right away.
Well, you did. I mean, my goodness, to walk in, most of us as freshmen are sort of seen and not heard, and we kind of get through our time, and we're busy learning the process. You were confronted with really one of the great natural disasters in American history within a year, less than a year after arriving here.
That's right.
So I know Katrina didn't hit your district, and then Rita did. So let's start with Katrina. What was the immediate impact, and then tell us about what happened when Rita arrived.
Well, clearly Katrina was a major disaster, and it affected the southeastern part of the state. I, along with the rest of the delegation, weighed in and started rolling up our sleeves to work. What happened in the immediate aftermath was there was not a real clear line of command and control in this process, because you have the local level, the state, and the federal, and everybody was out there exchanging business cards in the middle of a disaster, and that's just no way to organize a response of that to a disaster of that magnitude that affected so many lives. And so a lot of the work we were doing was just trying to organize the response, getting people to listen, getting people to come together to solve problems. And I can tell you it was very difficult because the bureaucracy was at its worst in this whole process. And so clearly we need to take major steps to fix this. My district was hit with a wave of evacuees from Katrina. So we had a huge flow of people into my district, which stretched resources. And then 1 month later, my district got hit by Hurricane Rita, which was every bit as devastating. And so we had an interesting second set of problems with the evacuation and then the response, and now the recovery.
What did your folks do in receiving these evacuees? I mean, because it must have been literally by the thousands, overwhelming school systems, health systems, housing systems.
Exactly. One of the first things we did was we knew that there was going to be a problem. So I, along with our city parish president, basically the mayor in our largest city, got together. We put together a committee of business leaders, nonprofit leaders, to organize and then break down into separate subcommittees on education, health care, basic services, you name it, financial services. And we organized this in an ad hoc way, which really paid dividends because we had our big sports arena, which took in thousands. We had probably somewhere around 7,000 or 8,000 evacuees in there. And it worked beautifully because we had everything very well organized. And I believe it's a model for how to do things in the future. This was done in Lafayette, Louisiana, my hometown. Mm-hmm. And in fact, the First Lady came down. She was scheduled to spend an hour, and she was so fascinated with the level of organization and how well we had done this. She spent 3.5 hours there, and we had food, we had school supplies, entertainment for the children. We managed to get them all into school locally. It was a tremendous effort, an outpouring by our community.
You really do see Americans at their very best in these kind of crisis situations. I dealt with the Oklahoma City bombing, and it was a similar type thing in terms of the level of community support and private sector involvement. Literally immediately, people wanting to do things to be helpful. I'm sure your experience was similar in Louisiana.
Oh, no question about it. The outpouring of help, I had one doctor who basically volunteered for over 60 days straight away from his practice, got no compensation or anything for it. He just felt an obligation to do this. The outpouring by people from all walks of life to provide volunteer services, supplies, was truly amazing. That's the real American spirit, and that's, I think, something that was a true success in this disaster. And when you juxtapose that next to the government response, you realize people, out of the goodness of their hearts, know how to come together and organize, but government seems to be broken when it comes to that type of response.
Let's talk a little bit about that government response. First, in terms of what you were dealing with on ground, obviously, as your fellow Louisianans were literally flooding and desperately in need for help. What did the federal government do to assist you as your local community was literally organizing to receive this massive wave of people?
Well, initially, FEMA took about 48 hours to really get down on the ground. But the problem was they sent people, mostly who were volunteers, who had varied amounts of experience. The guys on the ground didn't have command and control authority. So communication was very sporadic and not very good. They could not make decisions. Oftentimes, if they did make decisions, they were erroneous, and then we had to backtrack, oftentimes costing local governments lots of money, millions of dollars at times. There was very poor coordination and communication between local, state, and federal authorities. And this type of response typically starts at the local level, then brings in the state, and then federal. And there's got to be a coordination of these efforts.
Where were decisions being made if people on the ground didn't have the authority to make them?
Interestingly, it was very chaotic, and oftentimes I had so many people calling my congressional office for authority to do things, and after a while I got so frustrated trying to locate who had the authority that I just gave people authority, and I said, the buck stops here. If somebody has a problem, tell them to call me.
And that's a very bold thing to do, because as you and I both know, and most of our listeners sometimes don't, when you're in Congress, you really only have your votes. You don't have any executive authority beyond your staff. You don't have the ability to make things happen. That's part of our division of powers. So to have taken that initiative, you took a lot of risks yourself.
Well, I did, and I wouldn't say I took all the risks. I knew that ultimately our county, or we have parishes in Louisiana, our parish authority, highest authority, is the one who really ultimately should be in control. That should be the decision maker. And everybody else should rally around that person, because that's the elected official who has the jurisdictional authority.
Well, and has assets, has a police department, has a fire department, has the sorts of things that you need.
And knows the community.
Right.
And so what I did was I teamed up with those authorities in each of the parishes, and I said, if you have a problem and you're having trouble getting authority, particularly on the federal end, then I'll weigh in and we'll make it happen. And I guess that was the surgeon in me coming out in an emergency.
Willing to make a decision.
That's right, because too often nobody was willing to make a decision.
Boy, that's true. I'm going to get to FEMA in a minute, but well, you've had this massive wave of people come in. Your community's organized beautifully to deal with it, despite perhaps not the appropriate help from higher authorities. And then, boom, here comes Hurricane Rita. So tell me what happens then when you actually now are not only dealing with refugees, but you have your own natural disaster unfolding in your community.
Well, first of all, we had observed many of the mistakes after Katrina, and so we said we're not going to make those mistakes. Number one, the local officials and law enforcement officials, National Guard, are going to cooperate, and we'll have a very clear line of authority. I remember sitting in a room with the parish officials who were hit the most by Hurricane Rita. I was in the room with them, National Guard General from Oregon, General Honore with the U.S. Army.
Very impressive guy.
Right. 82nd Airborne commanders, FEMA people, and we had a big discussion about who was going to do what. And then I remember the parish authority coming to me and saying, you know, I'm worried that the military may try to take over this, or who's really going to call the shots. And so I called everybody back into the room because we had broken for dinner that night. And I said, I want to clarify lines of authority because we're not going to make the same mistakes that happened in New Orleans. And General Honore looked immediately at me and says, you're in charge. I said, no, General, I'm not. I'm a legislator. This gentleman here is in charge. He's the parish authority. And he's in charge. He'll call the shots. Everything works through him. If we have honest disagreements, we'll hash it out before we go public with it. But he makes the call. And so we agreed upon that kind of line of communication, and it made a major difference. Our mayors did a wonderful job in orchestrating early evacuation. We had no deaths after Hurricane Rita. Plus, we had this additional wave of evacuees that we had to get out of the hospitals and everything else. But they orchestrated it beautifully because they had a plan and they followed the plan.
Well, I want to talk to you a little bit about your ideas and your experiences with FEMA. I've had a lot of them, ever beginning really with the Oklahoma City bombing in '95, and I dealt with the FEMA a lot as the Oklahoma Secretary of State. Worked very well, honestly, in the 1990s, and then post-Katrina, frankly, creation of Department of Homeland Security. My experiences, whether it's tornadoes or wildfires, have been significantly different and frankly, much less satisfactory. But from the experience you had in dealing first with evacuees, then with your own natural disaster, what kind of conclusions did you come to about how FEMA ought to be organized and what ought to happen to make things operate a little more smoothly? Exactly.
The first thing that needs to be done is that FEMA representatives should not be coming down into a disaster area and exchanging business cards with emergency personnel at the state and local level for the first time. There has to be this sort of integration of effort to do extensive and relentless preparation for disasters. And before the hurricanes occurred, I remember in July having a conversation with our then chairman of the Intelligence Committee, and I said, Chairman Hoekstra, you guys have done a great job with the intelligence community in trying to prevent an attack on our soil, but there's not a single community really fully ready for when something like that happens, whether it's a terrorist attack or a man-made disaster. And lo and behold, we saw that unfold with Katrina and with Rita to some extent. So FEMA needs to be working and preparing and making sure that plans are well thought out and that they're practical. They can be implemented, and that there's this relationship that's already built in when something happens. And then secondly, as a heart surgeon, I never wanted to have nurses walking into the operating room for the first time to help me with a complex open heart operation, and then I'd have to work with this inexperience. And then as soon as they started to help, they moved out and somebody else came in. And that's the other problem. FEMA officials who were volunteers, well-meaning, but did not have adequate experience. And then as soon as they learned the situation on the ground, they were rotated out and somebody new came in. And so those are problems at the federal level. At the state and local level, you need good, solid plans. Everybody needs to be well aware, and those plans need to be rehearsed so that everybody's aware of what's going on, what their roles are, and you've got to have good communication and lines of authority.
Hey, we had a situation with wildfires, and it took us 12 days to get a disaster declaration that frankly should have taken about 48 hours. And the FEMA regional office in Dallas had literally told our governor, look, just sign this letter, this will happen in 48 hours. So they thought it would happen that quickly as well. This was not just us arriving at this conclusion. It took 12 days. And the problem I found as I began to work it, and the big difference was FEMA was no longer a freestanding agency. You know, it made a lot of sense on paper to move it into Homeland Security, but what we did was create several layers of bureaucracy on top of it, literally between the FEMA director and the President of the United States, where the decisions are made on disaster declarations and the deployment of resources in some cases. And I think that's been a huge mistake. You know, the Department of Homeland Security exists primarily to protect us from a terrorist incident. That's not the case with FEMA. It's there to help in a terrorist attack, but you know, we're always going to have more hurricanes, more tornadoes, more floods, more fires, and we're going to have terrorist attacks. So its fundamental mission is very different, and the ability to move nimbly and quickly seems, in my opinion, to have been lost during this combination of FEMA with the rest of Homeland Security.
Tom, I think you're absolutely right. FEMA has lost that capability to mount a flexible, a scalable response. You know, so I mean, sometimes it's a small, localized federal disaster area that you have to get help in. Sometimes it's broader, like what we saw after Hurricane Katrina, where the entire Gulf Coast was affected. FEMA does not have that capability, and I think it needs to be clarified what's FEMA's role, how does it interact with the state and local authorities. I think the state and local authorities need to know, hey, if I'm going to be on my own for 48 hours, I need to be prepared and have resources ready. I think there's so many aspects to this that are being overlooked. I think, for instance, communities should have compacts between one community with the next to rely on resources. So you have this ever-widening concentric circle, the way to visualize it. I think there ought to be interstate compacts. For instance, my state of Louisiana ought to have an interstate compact with Arkansas, Texas, Mississippi, for supplies, for assistance, National Guard help. And then you got the private sector. And one of the things I found out, for instance, were hospital beds. The Hospital Association was trying to manage the allocation of hospital beds, and that was being done separate from FEMA and the state emergency response. And that private sector has to be integrated in. And then you have certain bureaucratic hurdles. For instance, if physicians and nurses want to come in to help, they have to get some kind of temporary licensure. That's a bureaucratic hurdle that needs to be expedited. Same thing with ambulance and first responders who, particularly ambulance providers who need licensure in a given state. So those things, that private sector needs to be coordinated in. You have to have those quasi-governmental entities that are coordinated. And I think too often the plans don't take all of that into account. And FEMA should take the lead in organizing that kind of effort. And that all comes under preparation. Because you have preparation, you have response, and then you have recovery when we go through something like this.
I think most Americans, even though we've all, of course, seen the horrific images on television of what Louisiana and the entire Gulf Coast went through in this, don't have much idea of the sheer scale of it. I mean, it really is something you have to see to believe. And I remember going down about 60 days after disaster and helicoptering from New Orleans out over to Biloxi, and it was just devastating. I'd talked actually to a gentleman of FEMA that I'd worked with during the Oklahoma City bombing, or who had left FEMA, but just to say, give me, why are things not working better? And he said, well, yes, mistakes have been made, no question about it, and we can do better than this, but he said, Tom, let me give you a comparison, and I always think this is instructive when we think about what happened with Katrina. He said, the World Trade Center was a 16-acre disaster site. It displaced about 50,000 Americans. We had working police and fire and municipal authority on ground, and we had immediate access to the disaster site by water and by road and frankly, by air. He said, gosh, Katrina was 90,000 square miles, displaced 1 million Americans. In most of that area, we didn't have really functioning municipal authority or police departments. They were just overwhelmed by the scale of disaster, and we couldn't even get to the stuff very quickly. So his point was, and he went on, he said, this is about as close to a nuclear event without the loss of life as you could have in the United States. So there's just nothing like it in our history. having experienced that, tell us what's happening now. I mean, how has Louisiana come back from something like this?
Well, it's going to be a long haul for us, and we are having significant problems with the housing program. We've had a number of issues that have arisen. Congress allocated money to the state of Louisiana in the form of a community development block grant to organize this housing program to help people get back in their homes and to rebuild. But yet, it's been fraught with bureaucratic hurdles, some at the state level, some at the federal level, that have really delayed the process. And so we still have a number of people out of homes. And now the program's projected to run short on money. And our current governor and our governor-elect are both coming to Congress to ask for more resources. This is a serious problem. You know, when you look at I'm so familiar with the New Orleans area. I spent 10 years of my life in New Orleans, and to see the images on television don't do justice to the magnitude. When I saw it firsthand in the hours after the storm had come through and the levees broke, it was just overwhelming. And yet, we don't, short of our Department of Defense, we don't have an entity that can be mobilized. I mean, we have the National Guard, but then you have to get governors to acquiesce, and that has to be coordinated. But to send in the Department of Defense troops, there are certain legal hurdles. You know, you have the Insurrection Act and posse comitatus. They cannot do or be put into a situation where they're doing law enforcement. So that all has to be coordinated, and somebody has to take charge of that. And I didn't see good federal coordination of that until General Honore came in, and then he just sort of did it in an ad hoc way.
He did a wonderful job. I tell you, you had another general down there, Hunter Down, who did an absolutely magnificent job. I remember, again, being there 60 or 70 days after, and he had taken us through the tour. And, again, most people don't understand this. We talk about mobilizing the National Guard to help, and they did a marvelous job in Louisiana. But a lot of them were disaster victims too.
That's right.
You know, as he actually showed us his house that had been destroyed during because he lived in New Orleans, and he said, "Look, most of my unit, which was a local unit," he said they were worried about their spouses and their parents and their homes, and yet here they've been working 60 at that point 2 straight days, trying to help everybody else, and so. You know, sometimes in situations like this, your first responders have got, mixed pressure on them or cross pressure on them. They're trying to do their job. They're trying to help everybody, but they're also thinking, my goodness, who's looking after my wife? Who's looking after my kids? Who's making sure that my property's secure?
That was a serious problem. Not only National Guard members from Louisiana, Mississippi, and other areas on the Gulf Coast that were their families were affected, their homes were affected. Our first responders, many of them had their homes destroyed, and they were concerned about their families. So typically, all of your infrastructure and personnel at the local level are also involved in the disaster and are feeling the effects of it. And so, how do you mobilize forces to come in to take in law enforcement? Health care, all these things that are critically important in the immediate aftermath of a disaster.
Well, obviously you follow this closely given the scale of what you've had to deal with in Louisiana and in your district. What's your assessment of what has happened post-Katrina to put us in a better position, if anything, to deal with these kind of problems?
Well, I know at the local level, everyone has reassessed, okay, what is it that we need to do? And what are our limitations? I think that's gone fairly well. And I've met with the emergency coordinators in each of my parishes in my district. I think the state has learned, the State Homeland Security Office has learned a lot about communication. We've taken steps at the state level. But I am still concerned that at the federal level we haven't done all that we need to do. Much of the effort has been focused on bureaucratic change and not necessarily on real-time change as to what needs to be done. We still haven't talked about, is there going to be some sort of force to mobilize to bring all kinds of assets to bear on a major disaster like this? And I'm not satisfied we've really heeded the lessons that these storms put before us and come up with really good solutions.
I tell you, one of the things that concerns me, having dealt with this, is, this is from discussions with FEMA officials. I was in a frustrating wildfire situation, and I asked the FEMA person in charge on the ground who was a wonderful professional. I said, why can't these things happen? He said, you know, Congressman, I don't have the authority that I would have had I been here during the Oklahoma City bombing, where we had, I got to tell you, wonderful FEMA cooperation. He said, a lot of that's migrated up the food chain, so to speak, into Washington, D.C., and you know, empowering people on the ground to make big decisions was part of what made FEMA, I think, work pretty well when it was outside the Homeland Security framework. Now that it's got to go up through successive layers, things are awfully slow and happening, and people making the decisions are not, or in many cases, not seeing the reality that local officials and local people are dealing with.
You're exactly right. The decision-making was so remote and removed by several layers of bureaucracy after these storms that it really created a problem. And then on the occasion where someone on the ground actually made a decision and was subsequently overturned after an expensive pathway was taken, it's a problem. I had a school system that was given conflicting information, and it's ultimately going to cost a school system, which is strapped for money, over $2 million. It's a very expensive proposition.
Yeah, see, I think in a situation like that, when local people are acting on the authority given to them by a local federal official who's on site, that they ought to be held harmless. You cannot do that, have them put enormous resources out and then say, sorry, we got it wrong, you're going to have to eat the cost.
Now, for the last 2 years, the big sports arena, the Cajun Dome that I mentioned in my hometown, basically is out of about $4.5 million. FEMA told them initially it would be okay to do what they were doing and to send the bill, and then subsequently they're having to either pay back money and they're not going to get certain reimbursements. And this is something I've been fighting for 2 years.
It's just simply unbelievable. Do you have any particular legislation, things you're interested in seeing, or is this a matter of just streamlining it administratively, so to speak?
Well, I think a lot needs to be done administratively, but also we're looking at legislation. We've been working on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, but again, Congress is sort of part of the problem because you got Transportation and Infrastructure Committee and you get the Homeland Security Committee, and there's this lack of coordination at the level of Congress. And so, again...
What? You mean we could be part of the problem here?
That's right.
Shocking.
Shocking. Positively shocking.
Well, Congressman, we're just about out of time, but I wanted to thank you for coming in today to join us in the show. I appreciate your service to the United States House of Representatives, and as Congress continues to debate these issues, rest assured that I'll be working to provide residents in the 4th District with the latest updates on FEMA and changes. I know you'll be working on these very same issues. So to our listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this particular edition of Cole on Congress, and particularly enjoyed hearing you talk about the challenges you had, my goodness, as a freshman.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for your leadership in Congress. You've been a great leader.
Well, you're kind to say that. I'm not sure that's true, but hey, get one of these shows your own, and I'll come on and call you a great leader.
There you go.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Charles.
Thank you.